I've always considered my neighborhood a safe place. The streets were quiet, the houses well spaced apart, each isolated in its own little world. When the Johnsons asked me to look after their house over a long weekend, I accepted without hesitation. They had a trip planned for a wedding and needed someone trustworthy to watch over the property. On the first night, everything was calm. The house was a modern structure with large windows and a top-notch security system, which gave me a sense of security. I did a round of the premises, checking that all doors were locked and the alarm system was active. It was when I returned to the main living room that the security system issued an alert. Someone was trying to access the garage. At first, it seemed like a false alarm. I imagined an animal might have triggered the sensor. But when the alert sounded again, it felt out of the ordinary, and my heart began to beat faster. So, like any normal person would, I decided to take a look. I walked to the garage with the light from my cell phone illuminating the path. The silence of the night was already bothering me, and every sound seemed louder than usual. I checked the garage and, finding nothing, decided it must have been just my imagination. I went back inside, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that it was something normal. But then, I discovered that the landline had been cut. My cell phone, which usually had full signal, now barely managed to pick up one bar. The feeling of isolation grew within me, exacerbated by my discomfort of being alone in such a large and remote house at that moment. That's when I saw shadows begin to quickly pass by the windows, as if someone was circling the house, which sent me into a panic. I tried to call the police, but the calls wouldn't go through. The reality of my vulnerability hit me like a punch. I hid in the nearest closet, but my heart was beating so loudly that I feared it could be heard from afar. I tried to make a call with my cell phone again, but only silence answered, interspersed with the frustrating beep of the call not completing. I covered my mouth with my hands, trying to muffle my rapid breathing and control the sound of my terror. I heard the front door being forced and heavy footsteps echoed around the house. I began to hear whispers and couldn't make out anything. They were coming from several directions. Fear literally paralyzed me. Then the front door gave in with a loud snap, followed by the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor of the living room. The steps were heavy and deliberate, as if the person walking believed they had all the time in the world. Tears began to form in my eyes as I internally struggled between the need to stay hidden and the urge to flee. After some time in that situation, my cell phone connection improved enough that I could call the police. I whispered my location and situation, begging them to come quickly. The minutes until the arrival of the police were the longest of my life. When I finally heard the sirens, I had never felt so relieved. The police conducted a sweep of the house and, although they initially found no one, clear signs of an attempted invasion were evident. The following days revealed a series of robberies in the neighborhood, with the thieves choosing houses that appeared to be empty. The experience left me with a persistent feeling of insecurity. It's always good to carry something to protect ourselves in case the police don't arrive in time. I was 35 when I decided to embark on a solo hiking adventure in a national park known for its extensive trails and dense forests. Seeking a weekend of isolation and nature contact, little did I know that I would encounter something that would forever change my perspective on hiking alone. Arriving early at the park, I started my journey under a clear sky and mild autumn weather. The silence was occasionally broken by the sound of leaves and branches snapping in the distance. Initially, I thought it might be an animal, but the frequency and variation of the sounds suggested something more. My unease grew when I noticed oddly arranged objects along the trail and recent marks on some trees. Clear signs of recent human activity in an area I expected to be deserted at that moment. As the sun disappeared on the horizon and it began to darken, my steps led me to a campsite that appeared to have been hastily abandoned. The remains of still warm embers indicated that the fire had been used recently. Around it, personal belongings were chaotically scattered, as if their owners had fled quickly from there. Half-rolled sleeping bags, a pot fallen next to the fire, and an open backpack with items spilling out. While I observed the scene, a chill ran through my body, leaving a trail of shivers. I began to imagine scenarios of what could have happened there. Could they have encountered a wild animal? Or could it have been something even more sinister? The solitude of the forest, which until then seemed like a refuge, began to feel like a stage of uncertainties. I started to feel apprehensive about staying there alone. Concern for my own safety grew. Perhaps it was not a good idea to spend the night there, and I increasingly felt the need to make a quick decision about what to do next. I decided to set up my own camp at a good distance from the spot, hoping that the night would pass peacefully. However, as darkness began to settle into the forest, the real horrors started. I began to hear footsteps around the camp becoming ever clearer, and many different noises came from between the trees. Each noise seemed closer than the last. Just mentioning it brings back the sensation of dread. Now imagine being alone in the middle of a remote place. When I turned on my flashlight, for brief moments, I saw figures moving quickly between the trees. They always seemed to appear out of the corners of my eyes, almost as if they were playing a sick version of hide and seek with me. The fear became unbearable, and I began to understand the previous campsite situation. Without hesitation, I quickly dismantled the camp and initiated a frantic retreat down the trails, guided only by the beam of my flashlight and the impulse to flee. I swore to myself as I ran that I would never again hike alone in that park or any other remote location. I never imagined that a weekend in Point Reyes at that old lighthouse converted into a vacation home would turn into one of the most terrifying moments of my life. It all began with the promise of a peaceful retreat, far from the chaos of the city. Sam, my friend and a marine biologist, had suggested the place, excited about exploring the local marine fauna. I, seeking peace and quiet, was eager for the isolation. We arrived at the lighthouse on a Friday afternoon. The incessant sound of waves breaking against the cliffs and the salty smell of the sea filled the air. As we explored the place, I couldn't help feeling a bit uneasy about the solitude. It was as if the lighthouse, with its imposing and ancient structure, held secrets in its time-worn walls. As night fell, the energy of the place began to fail. The lights flickered, and the lighthouse, which was supposed to automatically sweep the ocean with its beam, failed repeatedly. Sam, always the skeptic, attributed this to the age of the building and adverse weather conditions. But as he dealt with the fuses, I was startled by what sounded like whispers carried by the wind. Voices almost human but distorted and barely audible. The situation worsened when we noticed the lighthouse light behaving strangely. Shadows swiftly passed by the windows, playing a game of light and darkness that distorted reality. We decided to investigate together, but it was Sam who first saw it. A human figure standing at the edge of the cliff. He then went out to confront what he thought was an intruder, and suddenly his voice disappeared, swallowed up by the sound of the wind. Realizing I was locked inside the lighthouse, with the door inexplicably locked from the outside, my mind panicked. I yelled for Sam, but only the noise of the ocean answered. When I finally managed to force the door open, he had vanished into the dense fog. I returned inside, locking everything behind me, while those whispering voices grew louder, as if they were approaching. With each passing hour, the sounds worsened. I no longer knew if they were voices or the waves. The solitude of the lighthouse had turned into a prison. At the height of my exhaustion and terror, the unimaginable happened. A distorted and malevolent voice spoke directly outside the window, calling out both my name and Sam's in a tone that chilled my blood. There was no longer a phone to call for help. The line had gone down. The hours until dawn were long, each minute extended by a deep and paralyzing fear. When the sun finally rose, dissipating the fog and the shadows, there was no sign of Sam, nor of whatever he had seen. I called the police, who arrived hours later, but they could do nothing more than record the disappearance.